The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's hummed their endless mechanical song as Brooke Sullivan smoothed her scrubs for the third time that morning, the fabric crisp and sterile white, her movements deliberate and measured. Her hands were the hands of someone who had held lives together in places where the air tasted like copper and diesel, but here in Raleigh she moved through the corridors of Ward 7 like a ghost, competent but unremarkable, the kind of nurse doctors forgot about before they finished their coffee. The scrubs were a costume. The deference in her posture was choreography. The way she tucked her eyes down when physicians spoke was performance art perfected over 6 months of careful, deliberate erasure. The mute patient in room 714 was why she was here. His chart sat in her mind with the precision of classified briefing materials. 47-year-old male, retired from Naval Special Warfare Command, post-operative day 23 from experimental neurological intervention, nonverbal status, right arm bearing a tattoo she recognized like meeting an old friend across a crowded street. The word Nightingale in military stencil font. Her call sign. The name they had whispered when she moved through the rubble of Fallujah with 82 kilograms of wounded SEAL across her shoulders, 3 blocks under sniper fire, her lungs burning and her legs moving because stopping meant he died. That was 8 years ago. That was Baghdad. That was before she became just a nurse with a spotless nursing license issued to a woman who technically didn't exist. She checked his vitals at 0700, her fingers steady on the 4 line, her eyes tracking the monitor with the same precision that had once tracked infrared scopes and target acquisition systems. Blood pressure 138/82. Pulse 71 and strong. Oxygen saturation 97% on room air. The ventilator was off, his lungs worked on their own now, though the surgeon said his vocal cords might never function again. His eyes tracked her movement with the slow, searching quality of someone whose brain was rebuilding itself one synapse at a time. She saw no recognition there. Just a patient watching his nurse. Just a man with a tattoo of a word he couldn't speak anymore. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice soft and unremarkable as the scrubs. She didn't meet his gaze. Meeting gazes was the kind of thing that drew attention. "How did you sleep?" He didn't respond, couldn't respond, but his fingers moved slightly against the cotton blanket, a micro gesture that meant acknowledgement. His eyes stayed on her face as she documented his vitals into the electronic system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with muscle memory that felt like prayer. 23 days post-op. No fever. No signs of infection. The surgical team had accomplished what they came to do. They'd repaired the neurological damage from the IED blast that had taken his voice. Whether they'd given him back anything else remained to be seen. The morning expanded around her like a held breath. Shift change at 0700, nurses from night watch handing off to day shift, the smell of machine coffee and hand sanitizer hanging in the air. Brooke moved through it like she'd been part of the institutional wallpaper forever, her badge clipped to her waistband, her movement small and careful. She collected vitals from 3 other patients on her assignment, a woman recovering from hip replacement, an elderly man with pneumonia on day 4 for antibiotics, a younger male with post-surgical complications from a thoracic procedure. She charted everything. 1,200 hours of nursing school and 4 years of bedside experience showed in her hands. The classified background before that was something else entirely. Dr. Marcus Mercer arrived at 0800 for morning rounds like a storm system everyone could see coming. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the linoleum tiles with the precision of a metronome, the click, 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 and the air around him seemed to tighten with institutional authority. He was the kind of man whose presence made people smaller, whose voice carried the weight of a medical degree from Georgetown and a family history that included 2 other physicians and a sister married to a federal judge. His gaze swept across Ward 7's team of nurses with the casual dismissal of someone checking equipment. When he looked at Brooke, she felt it like the crosshairs of a scope. The grand rounds moved through patient by patient, Dr. Mercer stopping at each bedside with his entourage of residents and medical students trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. He spoke with absolute certainty about every decision, every medication, every next step in treatment. His hands moved with theatrical precision. His voice modulated between paternal instruction for the younger physicians and absolute command when addressing nursing staff. Brooke watched from the corner of the room, her presence so unremarkable that one resident actually startled when she handed him a clipboard. When Mercer reached room 714, he made a show of reviewing the SEAL's chart, his eye scanning the documentation with the careful attention of someone who was always looking for grounds to criticize. Brooke stood at the foot of the bed, her hands folded in front of her, her posture the picture of deference. The SEAL's eyes moved toward Mercer but without the recognition that lived in them when Brooke entered the room, a fact that meant nothing and everything. The discharge paperwork should be complete by noon, Dr. Mercer announced, his voice carrying down the corridor. This patient has recovered adequately. Continued hospitalization is unnecessary and expensive. Brooke felt the words land before they fully registered. She had read the surgical notes. Post-operative day 23 for neurological reconstruction. Delayed post-operative complications could manifest without warning. The patient's vitals had been unstable 48 hours ago. The discharge order violated every protocol for post-surgical monitoring that actually kept people alive. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't ask for permission. She just said the words quietly enough that only Mercer would clearly hear them, her voice modulated to suggest careful thought rather than challenge. Doctor, his cardiac workup wasn't completed until yesterday. The cardiologist flagged arrhythmia concerns. Maybe 72 more hours of monitoring. The temperature of the room changed. It was imperceptible unless you'd spent years reading a room's pressure before the bullets started flying. Click! Click! Click went Mercer's shoes as he turned to face her. His eyes had narrowed to something like contempt, the expression of a man who'd just realized there was a mosquito in the room that hadn't immediately recognized its inferior position. Nurse Sullivan, he said, and the way he said her name made it sound like something that required quotes around it, something not quite real. Perhaps you have additional medical training I'm unaware of? A degree from some institution we might consult. The residents and students went quiet. The heart monitor in room 714 beeped its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, someone dropped a metal bedpan with a sound like a cannon shot. Brooke's hands remained folded. Her breathing remained level. She had practiced this posture in a mirror for 3 weeks before starting at St. Michael's, the performance of a woman who had never held a weapon or given an order or carried another human being through an active combat zone. Just following the post-op protocol, doctor, she said. Her voice was soft. Apologetic. Everything he wanted to hear from someone of her station. The surgical notes mentioned. I'm aware of the surgical notes, nurse, he interrupted, his tone suggesting she'd just tried to explain basic mathematics. I wrote them. The discharge will proceed as planned. He turned away from her with the finality of a closing door, his entourage of residents falling into step behind him like a shoal of fish recognizing the apex predator. One of the younger residents, a woman who looked no older than 28, glanced back at Brooke with something that might have been apology or might have been complicity. Brooke watched them move down the corridor until they disappeared around the corner. The SEAL's eyes had followed Mercer's departure. Now they returned to Brooke's face, searching it with the slow, deliberate quality of someone trying to solve an equation written in a language he'd forgotten. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She documented the blood pressure, the heart rate, the oxygen saturation, her fingers moving across the tablet keyboard with the muscle memory of someone whose hands remembered how to do thousands of things her mouth could never speak. She would go to the chief of nursing. She would appeal the discharge. She would cite the cardiologist's notes and the protocol violations and the statistical likelihood of post-operative complications within the critical observation window. These were the tools available to a woman whose actual authority, captain in the United States Navy Medical Corps, operational security clearance at the TSSCI level, 8 years of combat trauma medicine, was locked away behind layers of false identity so complete they would survive a background investigation. But not yet. First she had to see how far Dr. Marcus Mercer was willing to go. First she had to understand the depth of his contempt for anyone who questioned his authority, especially someone who wore scrubs and a badge that labeled her as less than. First she had to let him believe that what he had just seen was a nurse knowing her place and accepting the correction. The fluorescent lights continued their endless humming as Brooke moved through the rest of her rounds, her presence so unremarkable that a family visiting their recovering grandmother actually had to ask which nurse to call. She took the question as a compliment. She took the dismissal as evidence of perfect operational security. She took the knowledge that her patient was being discharged into inadequate monitoring as a ticking clock she had no way to stop through institutional channels. And that was when the real nightmare was about to begin. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Dr. Mercer dimmed the conference room and pulled up the first slide. 40 staff members sat in the tiered seating, their coffee cups steaming, their attention not yet focused. Brooke stood directly in front of the projection screen, her shadow breaking across a handwritten vital sign abbreviation, one of hers from a trauma admission 3 weeks prior. "Class," Mercer began, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man about to demonstrate someone's incompetence before an audience. "Observe what happens when diploma mill graduates attempt clinical judgment." The slide enlarged. Her charting decision, magnified to 4 feet high, exposed for dissection. The abbreviation she'd used, field triage notations from her Baghdad rotation, standard combat medical shorthand, looked foreign in a Raleigh hospital context. Standard for a military field hospital. Completely authentic. Completely unrecognizable to anyone who'd never worked under mortar fire. Here, Mercer circled the margin with a laser pointer. The red dot danced across her handwriting like a predator's eye. A critical patient. The nurse documents, and I quote, "BP compensating." Not compensated. Compensating. A fundamental misunderstanding of hemodynamic stability. This patient deteriorated for hours later. Could better documentation have prevented that? He let the question hang. A resident coughed. Someone's pen clicked. Brooke kept her hands at her sides, her breathing even as a metronome. Her jaw tightened by maybe 0.5 millimeter, the kind of movement only someone trained to recognize micro-expressions could catch. She didn't break eye contact with the projection. And here, Mercer continued, advancing to her admission note for the seal in Ward 7. Pre-op neurological assessment. Pupils equal, round, reactive but with artifact, and artifact being a term I've never seen in standard nursing documentation. Where did you get this terminology, nurse night shift? A correspondence school. That was new. Nurse night shift. The nickname carried contempt like a weapon carries bullets. A few residents exchanged glances. One junior resident, eager to appear clinically rigorous, made a note on his iPad. The room temperature seemed to rise 3 degrees. Brooke took one measured breath through her nose. Her hands remained steady at her sides. Her expression remained neutral, not blank, but composed with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She'd held a man's open thorax in her palms in Baghdad while rounds impacted concrete 6 inches from her boots. This was fluorescent lights and professional cowardice. She could breathe through this. Mercer clicked to the next slide. Then the next. Each one a dissection of her work. Each one framed as evidence of incompetence rather than difference in training methodology. He spoke for 22 minutes. Brooke stood in front of the projection for all of it, her shadow a silent witness to her own character assassination. When he finished, he said, "Questions?" "No?" "Well, I think the data speaks for itself." "Thank you, nurse night shift. You can return to your station." The dismissal was deliberate. Clinical. The kind of crushing politeness that made cruelty institutional. She nodded once and walked out of the conference room with her posture unchanged. Her shoes clicked on the tile with perfect rhythm. Behind her, someone whispered, and 3 people laughed, the kind of nervous laughter that happens when the power structure has been demonstrated and everyone's relieved it wasn't them standing in front of that projection. 1 hour later, at 1,107 hours, Brooke stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, feeding dollar bills into the slot for black coffee. The machine hummed and dispensed it, cheap, hot, the taste of resignation. She'd just finished medication rounds on Ward 7. The SEAL's vitals were stable. His neurological responses were plateauing. She documented everything twice, once for the hospital system, once in encrypted format for her handler. The elevator doors opened. Dr. Mercer stepped out wearing the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from a successful performance. He'd already moved on to other prey. A resident, 2 interns, and a nursing student had followed him out of the conference room in his wake like remoras following a shark. He saw her at the vending machine and adjusted course. "I was just telling Dr. Harrison about staffing concerns," Mercer said, addressing his entourage but speaking loud enough for the corridor to hear. "Particularly regarding personnel whose credentials don't quite add up. I mean, how does a nurse appear in our system 6 months ago with a spotless record? No previous employment history before that date. It's unusual, wouldn't you say?" He pulled his own dollar from his wallet and fed it into the machine beside hers. "I wonder aloud if diploma mill graduates should be allowed near critical patients. Especially ones who think field experience, whatever that might mean, trumps actual medical education." One of the interns laughed. High-pitched. Nervous. Mercer smiled like a shark showing its teeth. Brooke didn't turn her head. She let the coffee cup fill completely, the machine hissing and steaming like something alive. The sound filled the space between them, that mechanical breathing, that familiar violence of hot liquid meeting plastic. Then she turned to face him. Her eyes met his directly across the 3 feet of corridor that separated them. Her voice came out quiet enough that only Mercer and his immediate circle could hear it clearly. But it carried weight. "My patients seem to survive at higher rates than yours, doctor." The statement was delivered with the flatness of recorded data. Not angry. Not defiant. Just factual. The kind of statement that would require him to either defend his mortality statistics in front of witnesses or accept the implication in silence. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. Not a tremor, not a breakdown, just the single muscular response of whatever part of her was still human enough to react to public humiliation. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her hand was steady as a surgeon's, no trembling, no hesitation, just the economical motion of someone removing an obstacle and continuing the mission. The tear was gone in less than 2 seconds. The corridor went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and in that buzz was the absence of laughter. The machine finished its cycle and beeped softly, a small, mechanical sound that might as well have been a gunshot in that silence. Mercer's face went the color of raw beef. His jaw worked once, twice, searching for a response that wouldn't sound worse than what she'd just said. He found nothing. You couldn't argue statistics in front of 4 witnesses without looking defensive. You couldn't question her medical judgment while she stood there with perfect composure and one dried tear mark. He turned and walked away, his residence trailing in his wake like remoras following a shark that had suddenly remembered it was a shark. Brooke picked up her coffee. The cup was hot enough to burn if she wasn't careful. She held it in both hands, feeling the heat transfer through the paper to her palms, and she walked back toward Ward 7 at the same measured pace she'd maintained all morning. But that wasn't the worst part of what came next. An hour into her afternoon medication rounds, Mercer appeared in the doorway of the SEAL's room. He positioned himself so she couldn't pass without directly interacting with him. He was holding a printed list, medication reconciliation, he said. Just routine. But his eyes tracked every movement of her hands as she worked, every calculation she made before pushing medication into the 4 line. Interesting dosage choice here, he said, tapping the list. The patient is for 80 pounds. Medication protocol suggests 0.8 milligrams per kilo. Did you calculate that correctly, or are you using field medicine dosing again? The math was correct. She'd done it 3 times. But she didn't argue. She simply replied, standard hospital protocol. Verified against pharmacy. He made a note on his own tablet. His presence hung in the room like smoke, not quite a threat, but not quite a suggestion either. Oppressive. Present. Impossible to ignore. He did this room to room. Followed her through medication rounds. Questioned her dosage calculations that were correct. Asked if she understood basic pharmacology. Suggested aloud to a passing physician that some nurses have more confidence than competence. And through it all, Brooke continued working. Her hands remained steady. Her voice remained level. She documented everything with precision, every medication verified, every calculation double-checked, every action that Mercer was witnessing conducted with clinical perfection. But she was aware, with a part of her brain trained for tactical assessment, that security guards had begun appearing near her station. 2 of them, casual positioning, not obviously assigned but obviously present. Mercer's suggestion must have been effective. In Ward 7, the SEAL lay in his hospital bed and watched this unfold through the partially open door. His damaged eyes tracked her movements. His hands, strong enough to squeeze a stress ball until the seams threatened to split, clenched around his bedsheet as Mercer walked past his room for the 4th time that afternoon, his presence a constant pressure. The SEAL's monitors showed elevation, heart rate up 3 beats per minute, respiratory rate climbing slightly. His jaw worked soundlessly. Whatever he wanted to say about the woman standing in his doorway, about the man circling her, about the institutional machinery beginning to grind toward some conclusion he couldn't stop, it died in his throat where his voice had already died 6 months prior. At 1,603 hours, a notice appeared in Brooke's personnel file. Her phone buzzed with an alert, official communication from the North Carolina Board of Nursing. Investigation pending. Report for interview Friday, 0900 hours. Verification of credentials requested. She read it in the medication supply closet, standing in the cool darkness among the plastic bottles and the pharmaceutical smell of industrial disinfectant. Her hands, finally, trembled. Just slightly. Just for 3 seconds. Just enough to know that whatever composure she'd maintained all day had limits. She pressed her palms against the metal shelving and breathed once, twice, 3 times until the trembling stopped and the soldier returned fully to replace the nurse. Then she emerged back into the fluorescent lights and continued her rounds. The monitor's alarm cut through Ward 7 like a blade through silk. 0300 hours. The numbers on the screen told the story before Brooke's eyes confirmed it. The SEAL's body arched backward, spine bowing as seizure current electrified every muscle fiber. His jaw clenched so hard she heard the grinding of teeth from across the room. No sound came from his throat, he couldn't scream, never could, but his body screamed for him, thrashing against restraints that suddenly seemed fragile as paper. Oxygen saturation plummeted. 94, 88. 79, the red numbers descended like a countdown. Brooke's hand hit the code button. Not a request. Not a gentle alert. She pressed it hard enough to feel the spring resistance, and the intercom erupted, Code Blue, Ward 7. Code Blue, Ward 7. The SEAL's airway was collapsing. She could see it in the way his chest heaved but drew no air, the desperate sucking motion against an anatomy betrayed by the experimental surgery that had promised to restore his voice but instead had left him more vulnerable than before. His lips turned the color of old bruises. Blue spreading like watercolor across pale skin. Doctors arrived in waves. They always did, that automatic response, the muscle memory of trauma medicine that made them converge on crisis. Brooke counted them as they entered, Dr. Peterson first, jaw tight, already shaking his head before he'd even assessed vitals. Dr. Chen right behind him, glancing at the chart and stepping backward as if proximity to tragedy might contaminate her. Dr. Williams, Rodriguez, Okafor, Steinberg, Park, Gupta, Mallory, Fisher, Brennan, Tomlin. 12 physicians in a semicircle around a dying man, their white coats forming a wall between the patient and intervention. 12. The number crystallized in her mind with the precision of a sniper's count. DNR status is unclear, Peterson said, not a question, a deflection. His voice carried the tone of someone reading from a legal document rather than observing a patient whose oxygen sat was now 71 and falling. Neurological cases aren't my specialty, Chen added, already backing toward the door. Her shoe squeaked against the linoleum with each step backward. Williams didn't wait for the rhythm to stabilize. He didn't even look at the patient. He looked at Brooke. The nurse's assessment is unreliable. Those exact words. The same exact phrase Dr. Mercer had whispered in the hallway 30 minutes earlier, his voice carrying through the break room like a virus spread through air vents. his network functioning perfectly. She could trace the contamination, Mercer to Williams to Chen to Peterson, his doubt seeded into minds already inclined toward self-preservation. The SEAL's monitor shifted rhythm. Ventricular fibrillation now, the heart's desperate scrambling, chaotic electrical pulses with no organized purpose. VFib was survivable if you moved fast. VFib was death if you hesitated. 60 seconds before it degraded into asystole. Flat line. The end. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, framed by the fluorescent lights like a performance, arms crossed against his chest in the posture of a man absolving himself. He didn't enter the room. That was the tell. The refusal to cross the threshold meant he'd already decided this patient wasn't his responsibility. Perhaps Nurse Sullivan can handle this with her special training, Mercer said, and the words arrived like a trap snapping shut. Everyone in the room heard it. Everyone understood it. He'd just given her permission to violate every licensing requirement that separated her from practicing medicine, then made it clear that any action she took would be documented, reported, weaponized. Practicing medicine without a license meant license termination. It meant possible criminal charges. It meant her cover story, the unremarkable nurse nobody questioned, would evaporate into an investigation that reached into places she couldn't afford to be investigated. But the SEAL's monitor showed asystole now. Flat line. The rhythm that meant his heart had stopped trying. Brooke's hand moved to her pocket. The movement was automatic, muscle memory older than her nursing credential, deeper than any protocol manual. Her fingers found the folding combat knife she'd carried since Baghdad, the blade folded into the handle like a secret weapon, like a reminder that some problems required solutions that existed outside the institutional architecture of hospitals and chain of command. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury for people who hadn't watched soldiers bleed out in desert sand because they'd waited for someone else to act. The lighter from the supply cart, she kept one there for exactly this scenario, though nobody knew it. Her thumb sparked the flame and she held the knife blade into the heat for 3 seconds, watching the metal glow. Sterilization. Not perfect. Adequate. The only acceptable standard when perfect meant death. Her hands didn't shake. That was the muscle memory talking. That was Captain Sullivan, the one who'd carried wounded through Baghdad under sniper fire, the one whose call sign Nightingale meant someone always made it out alive, surfacing through the careful construction of this nurse who questioned nothing and accepted everything. That would be practicing medicine without a license, Nurse, Mercer said, his voice sharp, triumphant. He'd finally found a violation he could document. He'd finally found something that would destroy her credibility beyond repair. The 12 doctors remained frozen. Spectators. Witnesses to a legal violation they would later describe in meticulous detail to hospital administration, to the board of nursing, to whoever came asking questions. The SEAL's monitor remained flat. A single unbroken line. The sound it made was like silence translated into frequency, a steady hum that meant his heart had stopped, his brain was dying, his lungs had surrendered. 90 seconds. Maybe less. Brooke's left hand positioned itself on the SEAL's chest, fingers counting down from the clavicle to locate the 5th intercostal space. Her right hand, the one holding the blade, didn't tremble. The skin of her palm was slick with sweat but her grip remained firm, the handle seated against her calluses like it belonged there. Code blue, we have asystole, she said, her voice level, clinical, the tone of someone simply narrating what the monitors already showed. Not defiant. Not desperate. Professional. I'm initiating emergency airway management. The blade moved across her own palm first, just enough pressure to ensure the edge was sharp, to ensure she understood exactly how much force the tissue would require. Blood bloomed red against her lifeline, and she felt nothing. Pain was information. Pain was data. Right now, the data was that she had seconds left and a knife and 12 reasons why she was about to lose everything. Her right hand positioned the blade point at the intercostal space between the 5th and 6th ribs, left anterior lateral approach, the path she'd learned in a trauma surgery course she was never supposed to have attended, the procedure she'd practiced on cadavers in a medical training facility that officially had no record of her enrollment. She cut. The blade moved through skin and subcutaneous tissue like a surgeon's motion, precise and controlled. The incision may be 2 inches long, just enough access. The muscle underneath presented resistance, pectoralis major fibers tightened under the intrusion, but the knife was sharp and her knowledge of anatomy was absolute. She'd mapped the human body in ways medical school hadn't taught. Mercer's voice, that would constitute security, she said, not looking at him, her attention entirely on the space she'd opened in the SEAL's chest. Call security. Blood welled from the incision, but that was secondary. The blade continued deeper, through the pleura, and suddenly there was something else, air escaping with a hiss as the sealed space of the chest cavity was violated. Pneumothorax, already present, the collapsed lung adding to the crisis. She could work with that. She could work with any problem that had an anatomical solution. Her hand found the rib cage, felt the bone structure beneath her fingertips, and positioned her fingers to palpate deeper. The knife widened the incision, intercostal muscles separating, and then there was access to the thoracic cavity itself, the space where a heart should have been beating and wasn't. 1 minute 30 seconds since flat line. Her hand entered the chest cavity. The sensation was distinct, familiar, like coming home to a place she'd never wanted to return to. Warm. Slick. The anatomical chaos of a body in complete failure. Her fingers found the heart, a muscle the size of a clenched fist, motionless, and she positioned her palm against the posterior surface, ready to begin direct massage, ready to force the organ to do what it had stopped doing voluntarily. Stop this right now, Mercer was saying, but his voice was distant now, background noise like the ventilator's wheeze or the flat-lined monitor or the fluorescent light's electric hum. Security is 2 minutes out. You're committing a felony on hospital grounds. Get me a 4.0 silk suture, Brooke said to nobody in particular, her voice steady, surgical. And keep that airway clear. Nobody moved. The 12 doctors stood frozen, witnesses to something that violated every boundary they'd been trained to respect. But none of them left. None of them looked away. Her hand began its work. Direct cardiac massage, her fingers moving in the rhythm she'd learned from corpses and from necessity, pressing the lifeless muscle against the breastbone, forcing blood through chambers that had stopped cooperating. Once. Twice. 3 times, and the monitor remained flat. 4 times, and suddenly, a spike in the rhythm, something, a single complex that might have been artifact or might have been the beginning of electrical activity returning to a dying organ. 5 compressions and the rhythm shifted again. There. A second complex. Then a third. Her hand continued its work while Mercer's voice faded further away, while footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, while somewhere in the distant sirens announced the arrival of crisis in a hospital that suddenly couldn't look away from what Captain Sullivan was doing with a folding knife and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived everything else the world had thrown at her. Her hands found his heart in the darkness behind his ribs. The thoracotomy was a 4-inch window open between the 5th and 6th intercostal spaces, bleeding but open, her fingers entering a cavity that steamed with warmth and desperation. Muscle memory took over, not a nurse's training but a combat medic's certainty, hands that had done this in a Baghdad courtyard while mortars walked closer, 1, 2, 3 blocks away. The knife lay discarded on the instrument tray. Mercer had retreated, his threat swallowed by the sound of her compressions beginning. 30. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her fingers squeezed the SEAL's ventricle with the pressure of someone who understood that gentleness was a luxury neither of them could afford. Blood coated her scrubs to the elbows, warm and insistent. 20. 15. 10. She didn't count out loud. The only sound was her breathing, steady as a machine, and the wet compression of living tissue responding to pressure. 5 compressions remaining. His heart lay in her palm like a small animal refusing to wake. 4. 3. 2. 1. Release. Reassess. The monitor showed flat line. Still nothing. The room held its breath the way rooms hold breath when hope is running out of oxygen. Again, she said. Not a request. A command. 30 more compressions. Her hands moved with the terrifying precision of someone who had already survived the worst the world could throw at her. The rhythm was hypnotic, compress, release, like CPR, but this was something older, something primal, her fingers trying to convince a heart that had already quit that it hadn't been given permission to quit. 60 seconds passed. 90. The monitor remained a flat line like a sentence with no ending. 120 compressions. For minutes. The medical rule, no resuscitation after 4 minutes of cardiac arrest meant brain death was arriving like a dark train no one could stop. But Brooke Sullivan didn't work by rules written by doctors who'd never held a life in their hands and felt it trying to slip away. 30 more. Her jaw was locked tight as a vault. 150 compressions. 200. The sweat on her forehead dripped onto the sterile field she'd created with that knife and the lighter, a sanctuary of desperate improvisation. Then it came. A rhythm. Sinus, she said. The monitor agreed. A line appeared, peaked, disappeared, appeared again. The SEAL's oxygen saturation climbed like a prayer being answered. 62. 68. 75. She didn't remove her hand from his chest. 80. 85. The line became a wave, a conversation between heart and electricity and the body's absolute refusal to surrender. 92. His heart had remembered how to beat. The 12 doctors who had refused to intervene suddenly remembered how to move. They swarmed the bed like a school of fish catching a current. Ventilators appeared. Monitoring leads multiplied across his chest. Post-resuscitation protocol unfolded with the precision of people who'd been ready all along, just waiting for someone else to do the impossible first. One of them, Dr. Patterson from cardiothoracic, nodded at her. A nod that meant everything the words wouldn't say. The SEAL's heart continued its resurrection, climbing toward stability with every beat. Brooke stepped back. Her hands were crimson. The combat knife lay on the instrument tray like evidence, which it was. Mercer stood in the doorway, his face unreadable for exactly 3 seconds. Then his phone rose to his hand, and she watched him photograph the knife. By 0600, his network accelerated like a storm system forming over water. The first call came to Hospital Administrator Robert Chen at 5:51 a.m. Mercer's voice carried the tone of a concerned colleague, grave, measured, worried for patient safety. "I'm deeply troubled. The situation escalates. One of our nurses performed a dangerous unauthorized procedure, an invasive surgical intervention without physician supervision. I'm worried about her mental stability, frankly. I think we need to discuss her employment status before something worse happens." The second call went to Dr. Helena Morrison on the Board of Nursing. "I've documented violent behavior. A controlled person would never, well, let's just say I question her psychological fitness." The third call to FBI Special Agent Marcus Williams in Charlotte, 3 words, identity fraud. Potential national security breach. Her credentials don't align with her background. By 0800, the paperwork had begun its metamorphosis. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Weapons on hospital grounds. Mental instability. Unprofessional conduct. A formal inquiry opened before Brooke had even finished her charting. The North Carolina Board of Nursing received a complaint citing concerns about her qualifications. FBI internal memo flagged her spotless record as suspiciously manufactured, warrants investigation. Mercer had spent a decade climbing the hospital hierarchy. He knew exactly which doors to knock on. The ones that made people listen. At noon, 2 security guards arrived at Ward 7. Their body language was apologetic, which made it worse. "Nurse Sullivan, we need you to come with us." The walk through St. Michael's became a perp walk, the kind where everyone pretends not to watch but their eyes track your movement like searchlights. Colleagues she'd worked with for 6 months suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. Nurses she'd trained with averted their gaze. The 12 doctors who'd refused to intervene stood in clusters discussing something intensely important that clearly wasn't her. Mercer watched from the doctor's lounge, coffee in hand, his expression serene as a predator that had finally caught its meal. The security guards didn't put her in handcuffs. They didn't need to. The humiliation was its own restraint. The building itself had become hostile territory, the fluorescent lights humming an accusation, the tile floors echoing judgment. She was being removed not as a criminal but as a potential hazard, which somehow felt worse. By the time they reached the administrative office, everyone on 3 floors knew that Captain Brooke Sullivan had been escorted from the hospital by security. The paperwork was already waiting. At 1700, exactly 5 hours after her dismissal, Brooke stood in the hospital laundry room with its industrial washers and the chemical smell of bleach fighting with blood. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in their own cage. Her blood-stained scrubs lay on the sorting counter, and she folded them with military precision. Hospital corners on the fabric. Sleeves creased perpendicular to the body. The final indignity, performed perfectly. The unit patch had fallen from her jacket lining during the security escort. It sat on the floor near the dryer, a faded Navy Medical Corps insignia with a small captain embroidered below. The acronym for the rank she was never supposed to reveal. The call sign she carried in place of a name. She could have picked it up. Instead, she left it there like an offering to a god that wasn't listening. Her hands didn't tremble as she folded the last sleeve. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind something worse, the clarity of mission failure. The SEAL upstairs was stable, breathing on his own, protected by his unconsciousness from knowing that his guardian had been dismantled by paperwork and whispers. Naval intelligence would collect her within the hour. A new assignment would materialize. The Pentagon would activate protocols for exactly this scenario, because this scenario was always possible when a warrior tried to hide in scrubs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd failed to keep the most important promise. She'd been there to protect him, and instead, she'd exposed him. The knife, the procedure, her hands inside his chest, all of it documented now. All of it evidence. The 12 doctors would be questioned. Security footage would be reviewed. Her record would be examined for inconsistencies, and they would find them, because her record had been carefully constructed for a nursing position and nothing more. She carried her folded scrubs to the collection bin. The unit patch remained on the laundry room floor. She didn't look back. But at 1703, 3 floors above, the SEAL's eyes opened. At 1703 hours, exactly 5 hours after security escorted her from the building, the mute Navy SEAL's eyes opened in Ward 7. His damaged vocal cords, scarred from years of screaming orders in Kandahar, produced a single rasping sound that hadn't emerged in 18 months, a word. A name. Nightingale. His hand trembled as it reached for the floor beside his bed, where Brooke's faded unit patch lay against the linoleum, the Navy Medical Corps insignia with a small captain embroidered below, fallen from her jacket lining during the struggle when she'd driven her knife through his chest cavity to restart his heart. He held the patch like a man holding proof he wasn't losing his mind. The embroidered thread caught the fluorescent light. He stared at it the way another man might stare at a photograph of someone presumed dead. 3 floors down, a Marine liaison officer named Captain James Halloway had been standing unnoticed in the corridor for 6 hours, watching. Just watching. He'd been positioned there by naval intelligence the moment the SEAL checked in, a shadow assignment, classified deeper than most admirals could access. When the patch hit the floor and the SEAL's eyes found it, Halloway moved. His boots made no sound on the tile. 18 years of special operations had taught him how to enter rooms like smoke. Captain Brooke Sullivan, Halloway said quietly, reading from a red-stamped folder. Bronze Star with Valor. The SEAL's head turned. His eyes locked onto Halloway's face the way a targeting system locks onto heat. Navy Commendation Medal, Halloway continued. Saved 14 lives under direct fire in Baghdad including. That's enough. Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the hallway like broken glass. He'd been making rounds in Ward 7, a final patrol of his domain, when he heard voices. When he saw the insignia in the SEAL's hand. When he understood, in the space of a heartbeat, that everything was collapsing. His face went the color of old concrete. That's a fabricated document. That woman is not a naval officer. She's a fraud. I reported her. I have witnesses. I have? Captain Sullivan, Holloway said, his voice the tone you use when explaining something to someone who's already made a fatal mistake, is operating under National Security Directive 44 Echo. That means, Doctor, that every call you made, every complaint you filed, every conversation with the FBI, all of it was interference with classified military operations. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish suffocating in air. Two men in dark suits appeared in the hallway before Mercer could speak. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. The way they stood, shoulders back, hands at rest, eyes like polished steel, said everything about what they represented. Federal agents. Their presence changed the air pressure in Ward 7 the way a Black Hawk's rotor wash changes air pressure on the ground. Dr. Marcus Mercer. The taller one held credentials that made Mercer's jaw clench. I'm Agent Torres, FBI Digital Forensics. We need to talk about your access to personnel files. The SEAL watched Mercer's face transform. The anger stayed. The arrogance stayed. But underneath it, something fractured. The look a man gets when he realizes he's been playing chess and the opponent's been playing a game 3 moves deeper the entire time. Within 18 hours, the rest became mechanical. Torres presented her findings to hospital administration in a conference room on the 14th floor. The server logs were irrefutable. Mercer had accessed Brooke's personnel file 17 times in 72 hours. He'd attempted to alter her employment start date, moving it forward to make her recent hire look suspicious. He'd deleted reference letters from commanding officers. He'd added fictional disciplinary notes claiming psychiatric concerns. Performance reviews that never existed. He'd built the entire fraud case he'd reported, constructing the crime scene like a carpenter building a house from blueprints that existed only in his mind. You understand what this is? Torres had asked, sliding the evidence across the table in a manila folder the thickness of a paperback novel. You tried to manufacture the evidence you claimed already existed. That's felony obstruction. That's tampering with a federal investigation. That's filing false reports with the FBI. Mercer's attorney, a woman in a gray suit who billed at $400 an hour and suddenly looked like she was reconsidering her career choices, leaned toward her client and whispered something inaudible. At 1,400 hours the following afternoon, federal agents walked Dr. Marcus Mercer out of St. Michael's through the main lobby. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the linoleum tile, one measured step after another. The nurse's station where he'd humiliated Brooke in front of 40 staff members sat 30 feet away. No one looked at him. The rule of institutional silence had activated. When a man falls hard enough, the people around him learn not to watch. He passed the vending machine where he'd caught her at 1,600 hours on a Thursday and called her diploma mill trash, where he'd spoken loud enough for 2 residents to hear, loud enough to matter. The machine hummed its mechanical indifference. He passed the conference room with the projection screen where her image had been dissected in front of the department. That room was empty now. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. The lobby doors opened with their automatic hydraulic hiss. The air outside was November cold and tasted like rain coming. Mercer walked between the 2 agents, and the doors closed behind him with finality that sounded like a gunshot in slow motion. The North Carolina Medical Board suspended his license within 24 hours. Pending criminal trial. Pending FBI investigation conclusion. Pending about 6 million other things that were about to destroy him with systematic institutional precision. The same precision he'd tried to use against Brooke. The same machinery he'd set in motion believing himself too connected, too credentialed, too embedded in the system to fail. But the system protected its own, and Mercer had tried to weaponize it against someone the system was quietly protecting at the highest levels. His attorney negotiated a plea deal over 6 months. 2 years probation. Community service. Permanent medical license revocation. He'd tried to negotiate a delayed start date on the community service, some time to regain his footing professionally, but the judge, a former Navy JAG officer named Patricia Hendricks, had denied the request with a single sentence: "You had your opportunity. You chose sabotage." And so at precisely 0900 hours on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after Brooke Sullivan disappeared from St. Michael's, the man who'd tried to destroy her was standing in front of a classroom at Raleigh Community College wearing a polo shirt in a color that made his face look even grayer than it was. $19 an hour. Benefits eligibility required 3 months full-time employment. He was demonstrating CPR chest compressions on a plastic dummy, pressing hard and fast to a metronomic beat, while nursing students half his age checked their phones and took notes they'd immediately forget. His hands moved through the motions with mechanical precision. Press. Release. Press. Release. Teaching the living how to save lives while his own had been methodically deconstructed by the system he'd trusted to support him. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away in a classified facility inside the Pentagon, Captain Brooke Sullivan stood in dress whites in a ceremony room with grey walls and no windows. The kind of room where history gets made that the public never knows about. Chief Petty Officer Webb stood beside her. He was walking with a cane now, his voice still rough from the neurological damage that had kept him mute for 18 months, but his eyes were clear. Military clear. The kind of clarity that comes from surviving things that should have killed you. Bronze Star with Valor, Admiral James Hendricks said, reading from a citation. His voice filled the small room like a command echoing off rock. Navy Commendation Medal. And for her actions in Baghdad, under direct fire, saving the lives of 14 service members including this officer, he paused. The silence stretched. The Navy Cross. 3-star Admiral Hendricks pinned the Navy Cross to Brooke's dress whites. The medal caught the light. Real gold. Real weight. Real recognition for actions that would remain classified for the next 20 years. He then saluted her. Held the salute. A 3-star admiral, hand to forehead, honoring a nurse who'd operated in shadows her entire career. Brooke returned the salute. Webb stepped forward. His damaged throat had worked for 6 months to repair itself enough to form complete sentences. You disappeared after Baghdad, he said, each word careful and deliberate. They told me Nightingale was KIA. But I got your call sign tattooed right here. He extended his forearm. The ink was faded but clear, Nightingale, in military block letters. So I'd never forget. So I'd never lose it. Brooke's composure finally cracked. Not tears. Something deeper. A smile that said she understood exactly what he was saying. I've had 4 different names since Baghdad, Chief. For identities. For covers. You're the only person who's ever recognized my actual face and known exactly who I am. That's because you saved my life, Webb said. That kind of thing is hard to forget, no matter what name you're wearing. Admiral Hendricks approached with new orders in a folder marked classified. Your next assignment, he said quietly. You requested to return to the field immediately. The director approved. You'll brief at 0600 tomorrow. Your new cover is solid. Your legend is clean. Your hospital is expecting you to arrive as a registered nurse, no additional credentials. Brooke took the folder. Inside was everything she needed and nothing she wanted to know yet. A new name. A new city. A new patient to protect. Another shadow assignment in a series of shadow assignments that would stretch across decades, maybe the rest of her career. This was what happened to people like her. You didn't get to retire. You got reassigned. You got a new patch to sew into a new jacket lining. Thank you, Admiral, she said. Thank you, Captain, he replied. The ceremony concluded. The dress whites went back into storage. The nurse scrubs were already waiting at an undisclosed facility in another city. Brooke walked through Pentagon corridors toward whatever came next, past classified doors and guards who didn't make eye contact because they'd been trained not to see her, and somewhere in a hospital she'd never been to before, in a city whose name she hadn't read yet, a new patient was about to meet a new nurse who would save their life without them ever knowing why. The quietest person in the room might just be holding it all together. If you want to see what happens when institutional power collides with actual sacrifice, when credentials meet character, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the stories that matter most are the ones nobody ever hears about. Drop a comment. What would you have done if you were standing in Brooke's position that first day? And share this with someone who needs to know that true strength doesn't announce itself. It saves lives in the dark.